morning, everyone. For today's conversation, I'm joined by Joanna Lewis, Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment. She's Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program, STIA, in the School of Foreign Service, and she joined our Georgetown faculty more than 10 years ago and is a faculty affiliate in the China Energy Group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So Joanna, it's wonderful to have this opportunity to be with you today. As we begin, your own research is focused on climate and energy issues in China. At Georgetown, you have also led the U.S.-China Climate Research Dialogue and the U.S.-China Energy and Climate Working Group. How did you come to this field of study, and can you describe the importance of international dialogue and collaboration in this work?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Well, when I think back, it was really when I was an undergraduate that I was struggling with the decision of whether to major in the sciences or to do something more policy oriented. And then I stumbled across a new major that had just been offered called environmental science and policy, which I realized would allow me to do both. And it was that major that really first introduced me to climate change. And, I thought, this is it, this is going to be one of the biggest challenges of my generation. And then, I thought about it and I realized that the energy technology decisions that were going to be made, particularly in the emerging economies, were essentially going to make or break our ability to reduce global carbon emissions. And so, that's what brought me to focus on China, just recognizing its crucial role, even back then, in the climate change solution. And so this then led me to graduate study in energy, led me to spend a lot of time in China, learning the country, the language, and the energy technology and policy landscape there. Of course, climate change is a global challenge requiring a global solution. And so international dialogue and collaboration are really crucial. But of course, it's difficult. And so in the last 5 years, of course, as you know, this has been a bit of a roller coaster for climate change. We've gone from reaching a monumental global decision to address climate change with the Paris Agreement 5 years ago this weekend. It's the 5-year anniversary. To then the US withdrawing from the agreement, and then to our incoming president now announcing the US will rejoin the agreement. So we wouldn't have the Paris Agreement without the role that the United States played in mobilizing global support for the agreement, and most pivotally, I think, through the US relationship with China. And so I launched this, the Georgetown U.S. Climate Change Research Dialogue back in 2016, when it was clear that the U.S.-China relationship was taking a turn for the worse, because I didn't want engagement on climate change to be a casualty of the deteriorating relationship. And so, this led to 2 years of great discussions and collaborative research on key climate change policy areas. Among the participants that, we chose topics that were of mutual interest to both countries. And, we brought the group to meet with government officials, both here in Washington and Beijing. And, we were warmly welcomed even during this period when the official relationship, I think, was pretty strained. So, I believe this sort of dialogue and engagement is really crucial to keeping the line of communication open. And, this dialogue also resulted in the building of relationships that continue and have actually also had a tangible impact on climate policy. So, for example, one of the American participants who I had invited to join our dialogue ended up making some recommendations on the design of China's emissions trading system. And they actually ended up being incorporated into the design of the program. So that was exciting.
Thank you. That's terrific. Now, you're currently working on a project funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, looking at the role of energy investment by China in emerging nations, where they're looking to advance their own energy and sustainability goals. Can you talk about this work and the impact that you hope it has?
Sure. So this project in many ways was designed to build upon the Georgetown dialogue. Of course, this project was envisioned during the pre-COVID days. So our initial concept was to look at topics that are of particular urgency for the climate challenge, but are also somewhat politically sensitive when looked at through a bilateral US-China lens. So our idea was to sort of flip the framing of this and instead to take a bilateral team of US and Chinese researchers, and particularly researchers who have the ear of policymakers, and rather than having them sort of talk at each other, have them jointly examine a topic. And so our focus was on the role that China in particular is playing in building coal plants around the world, which is tied to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and of course has very negative consequences for the climate. But of course, the U.S. can't just tell China not to do this. That's not a very effective approach. So, and there are certainly experts in China who are interested in actually understanding the real dynamics in these countries where China is investing, and what actually drives the decision of whether or not to build a coal plant or a solar plant, within these countries. So we're still conducting research on this topic. We can no longer conduct field work. And we had planned to bring a joint group of US and Chinese researchers to places like Indonesia to examine these dynamics on the ground. But now that we can't travel, we're instead, what we did is we formed a joint study group to essentially keep this same framing that I described. And together we are then, we have this group of US-China researchers who are speaking with experts on a range of important policy topics. And it's worked amazingly well, even over Zoom, because I think, again, this framing is the right one right now. It somewhat takes the pressure off participants to speak on behalf of their country's official positions, and instead they can put on their research hats and ask hard questions, and then we learn from each other's questions. So we compiled a great group, and I think this is the right approach right now, given the current political dynamics. And I hope it can have tangible impacts on both shaping the thinking of the participants, and then they bring that back to shape policy in their respective countries.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Now, you recently co-edited a book. It was released last month, Greening East Asia, the Rise of the Eco-Developmental State. Can you tell us a little bit about this project and how you view this shift from development to eco-development in the region?
Yeah, sure. This was a fun and somewhat unexpected book project. It originated from a conference that I was invited to almost 4 years ago now, that focused on environmentalism in East Asia. And usually I realized when I attend conferences, they're either on climate change or they're on China. And it struck me that this way of looking at East Asia in a comparative perspective was somewhat understudied, particularly when it comes to the diverse range of approaches that are being taken to environmentalism and environmental policy. And so four of us, the conference organizer and a couple other colleagues, we got together and we decided to pull together this edited volume that included, some of the topics we had explored in that conference, and then we built on that with additional authors. And we took the traditional developmental state model, which this framing is so commonly applied to East Asia, and we re-examined it with a focus not just on how states derive legitimacy from growth, but really how these states have been able to use environmental goals to drive development. And the book therefore examines, how we see these different states employ different mechanisms across East Asia, given the diversity we see in the region in governance, the varying roles of civil society, of litigation, and other factors within each national context.
Thank you. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that you're the director of STIA. Can you give those who may not be as familiar with STIA a sense of the program, and what's your vision? What perspective do you bring to your leadership of STIA?
Of course. So, I joined the STIA faculty 12 years ago now, and it's exciting to now have the opportunity to direct the program. I think most people at Georgetown know STIA for our, our highly successful undergraduate major. which is currently the second largest in the School of Foreign Service and growing rapidly. And we also now run a campus-wide minor across all 4 schools. That expansion is new this year. And we just launched our first master's program in collaboration with the MSFS program. So, what we do in STIA is we train our students in the key science and technology issues that shape international affairs. So this ranges from nuclear weapons technology to biotechnology to climate change. And we're also home to some of the most research active faculty in the university, who oversee large grants in the sciences, and faculty who engage in policy processes in Washington and around the world. So, it's really a great group of colleagues and students, and I feel fortunate to have ended up in this program. Because as I mentioned before, I am really the product of a truly interdisciplinary education, spanning both the natural and social sciences, at the undergrad and graduate levels. And so as a result, I feel like I'm part of a new generation of scholars that believes in the value and really even the necessity of interdisciplinary training. And so I bring this perspective to my leadership of the STIA program, and also to my involvement in building interdisciplinary programs and research initiatives across the university. And so, as director, my primary goal is to raise the STIA program's profile and impact. And I'm doing this by working with our faculty and staff to expand innovative learning opportunities for our students, to strengthen our faculty research base and particularly student engagement in that research. And then, really hope to strategically position STIA and Georgetown as a hub for engagement with policymakers and key stakeholders in the crucial science and technology challenges of our time. I really think STIA is poised to expand beyond our successful undergrad program and create new opportunities in all these areas. And, as a team of interdisciplinary scholars spanning the natural and social sciences, including, we're really well positioned to build bridges, I think, across the university, particularly with the science departments, including computer science, with the medical school. We have faculty with joint appointments in all these areas. Also initiatives like the Georgetown Environment Initiative and the Technology and Society Initiative. And of course, new centers like CSET, the Center on Security and Emerging Technology. So, I'm really excited to have the opportunity to lead this program through this transition.
Well, thank you for your leadership. I want to talk a little bit about this virtual moment. This semester, we were all in a virtual learning environment, and you co-taught the STIA undergraduate gateway course called Science and Technology in the Global Arena, which you teach regularly. Now, you led the module on science in the global environment. How did you approach this coursework in this moment, and how have your students responded to the class?
Yeah, our gateway courses is truly one of the things I'm most proud of in STIA. I had the opportunity several years ago, when the professor who originally designed and had taught this course for many years retired, to re-envision it. And it was really important for me to move away from a sort of traditional lecture format, and foster a more interactive learning environment, and even in a big class. And so what we did is we introduced the concept of these modules where, and each module culminates in a hands-on interactive policy simulation. And this allows us, the structure allows us to team teach the class, as you mentioned. So this means that the students can hear from the real experts on all different science and technology topics. We do different units each semester. And then this also gives them hands-on experience through role playing, which is really fun for them. So, I had the pleasure of leading the course during both of our pandemic semesters so far, the spring and fall. And so, have been really working to make sure that the simulations in particular can continue even in a virtual environment, since they're always the students' favorite part of the class. And, of course, we can't be in the classroom. Usually they're, running around the classroom, they're out in the hallways, they're trying to negotiate all sorts of international agreements. And, for example, my module, Science in the Global Environment, introduces students to the role that scientific uncertainty plays in shaping global responses to environmental issues. And it culminates in a week-long negotiation of an international mercury treaty. which is sort of modeled after the Minamata Convention negotiations. So this summer, I was able to work with Candles to identify a software that was created by the University of Michigan specifically for classroom simulations like the ones we do. And so we piloted that tool this semester in 4 simulations and combine that with other, types of tools that allow, really facilitate communication with the students, so they can participate even across distant time zones. And we try to replicate, that face-to-face interaction that they are really missing being out of the classroom. And I've heard from students, that the simulations have been a really important way, this semester to get to know each other and build a sense of community that they're otherwise having I think a hard time doing in this remote environment.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for taking the time for this conversation. Let me ask you in closing, is there a message that you'd like to share with our university community?
Well, I think when we're on the other side of this pandemic, I hope we will have time to assess our response and what we can learn from it. And, I've been surprised at the lack of global coordination, surrounding the pandemic and particularly just worried about how this maybe doesn't bode well for our potential ability as a planet to respond to other global challenges that may come our way, such as climate change. And I do think a key reason for this has been, the absence of U.S. leadership. The U.S. really traditionally plays such an important role in supporting and staffing the international organizations that we would often turn to in a situation like this. And, we've seen this, of course, in climate change play out as well. So I'm just hopeful that we are entering a new phase, just as we are entering what scientists call the decisive decade for dealing with climate change. And moving towards renewed U.S. leadership on the key global challenges of our time.
Well, thank you. Joanna, I want to thank you again for sharing your insights and thank you for your leadership in our community. I wish to again thank Professor Joanna Lewis for taking the time to speak with us today. And I look forward to being with all of you again soon. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.